Um, Engineering-wise, how important was Gemini 2 getting us to the moon on the date?
Well, I guess a lot of people might think that Gemini was kind of a substitute program because Apollo wasn't quite ready after we'd gotten all we could out of Mercury. But really, it was essential in the major objectives that we set out to perform in Gemini. One was to demonstrate that the life support system could support people in an outside environment, outside the spacecraft. So we needed to demonstrate spacewalking with life support systems that were certainly a step above just being connected to the spacecraft system. We needed to demonstrate sort of self-contained systems, and we approached that and also experimented with the potential of maneuvering units on backpacks. It was one of my great disappointments not to be able to fly that Air Force astronaut maneuvering unit. I certainly, my big regret is that I wasn't able to convince people that I knew what I was doing well enough to be able to activate that backpack, and I thought it was really kind of sad that NASA canceled that major experiment. And then on the last mission, Gemini 12, Jim Lovell and I were able to demonstrate very successful use of foot restraints and tethers and other things to be able to do difficult tasks, spacewalking.
Well, let me interrupt you there because I want to go on with that. I've interviewed Cernan and Dick Gordon and people like that. They had a lot of trouble out there. What did you do differently? What did Buzz Aldrin understand that these Navy guys didn't understand?
Well, I think Buzz Aldrin was a scuba diver, and he had experienced working with currents that tend to move you in a direction that you may not want to move, and you have to go with the current, and you don't try and fight the current. You can get very tired pushing yourself against something, and I became convinced that even though your body has a big mass, if you want to move it, you move it very slowly and very delicately, and if you're in the right position, you just don't let that get disturbed, and you make sure that you have good leverage before you try and exert some kind of moment or twisting. And
did you watch Cernan and Gordon out there? Were you watching the film and saying they're just doing it all wrong?
Well, no, I think certain things come naturally. You decide that you're going to move in a certain way and you need leverage, so you just don't allow yourself to get out of position. It's very easy to get frustrated because you can't see what you're doing, and I think in one case, one of the guys got all worked up because he was trying to move a visor. Well, it's very easy when things aren't quite working to get frustrated and try and, impatient because the time is ticking on and trying to do whatever it is, and you just figure that, well, if I exert a little bit more effort, maybe I can get this thing done. But that's the worst thing you do. You need patience, and you need to move slowly. And of course, at the same time that I was experiencing the advantages of underwater training in neutral buoyancy, why we were developing the foot restraints, and we convinced ourselves that Velcro on the bottom of shoes was just not going to work because it could be twisted and torn off, and just little hoops, your feet could slip out even if you canted them at an angle, so that, like riding on a horseback, you put your feet this way and then put your heels in, gives you some kind of leverage. That's an example of using this small amount of leverage to keep you from slipping out.
Well, let me ask you, how did you feel outside the spacecraft, knowing that it was going to be a challenge? Did you feel you performed well? Did you feel comfortable out there? How did you feel?
I felt that it was a piece of cake outside, just moving very slowly. There was no challenge. As long as I took my time and could see what I was doing. Visibility is very important, and the spacesuit is rather cumbersome, and it tends to obstruct your vision. And if you try and find something with bulky gloves and you can't quite get it, that can be frustrating too. And again, you need to understand that it may be floating around somewhere instead of hanging down. It just takes a little bit of patience and understanding.
Now, you did your PhD thesis on orbital mechanics. Why? Were you anticipating?
I went to MIT as a fighter pilot because I felt I needed more than just great skills as a pilot. I was a good pilot, certainly well above average. I shot down 2 MiGs while I was in Korea, and I was on the gunnery team with Ed White, and I could shoot gunnery as well as he could, and he got into the astronaut program. He was a test pilot. But I figured, well, you know, I needed a little bit more education. My father had gotten his doctor's degree at MIT, so that was an option then for an Air Force graduate program, and they offered courses in astronautics and in instrumentation. Well, I didn't want to specialize in the electronics of feedback control systems and instrumentation, so I selected the astronautics, and really the only difference was that we had more interesting navigation in the celestial environment of going between one object in space and the orbital mechanics, the equations of motion that derive the conic trajectories, and then from there you'd go through mechanics and mathematics, and of course I had done very well in high school in Montclair, New Jersey, that prepared me very well for West Point, and I stood at the very top of my class, especially in mathematics. So that came rather easy for me to understand it, and all of that appealed to me in a sense that, I felt that the idea of understanding navigation in a celestial environment was significant for things that would be happening in the future. I came to this background at MIT with astronautical guidance there and computers, but I was a fighter pilot, and I understood intercepting other aircraft for different types of fighter pilot maneuvers. So when I put all of this combination together and looked at some options for me to study and specialize in, 3 things came to mind. One was pilot control of reentry spacecraft. That had a lot of problems with it because the gas flow, the gas dynamics of heat exchange and heat entry was very complicated, and I didn't really see where a person in control could exert that much difference or to bring in a guidance trajectory for a precision landing in the reentry environment.
So what did you go for?
I saw another option that I could study, which would be landing people on the moon. We had decided to do that by that time, or it looked like we would. I couldn't see where the Air Force had a significant mission in landing on the moon, so I felt, well, there's so many uncertainties about that, I won't worry about that. But certainly, the idea of joining together spacecraft is going to be something that we need to do. And it's like an intercept, and maybe if I try and understand how that is being studied now and put my approach to it, that could be of significance to me. And when I look back on it and realize that in 1960 and 61, when I looked for subjects to pick on, and that's what I chose, I really couldn't have picked a better area to become somewhat of a seat-of-the-pants expert. And that's what it was. It's having an understanding of the motion of one object relative to another as they go around the Earth. And as they go around the Earth, in one revolution, the motion has a sinusoidal effect, and it repeats itself. And if you can understand if you have 2 planes and one is out of plane with the other, it's going to go back and forth relative to the other. Or it's going to go around, it's going to go down below one of them and then up above and back and repeat itself. Or if it's underneath, it's going to catch up and move by like this. Everything is a combination of all of those 3 basic motions. And you have to try and separate them and try and understand it.
Now, didn't that come into play? Didn't you have to do some pencil and paper mathematics on Gemini 12 with Lovell? There was a miscalculation. You pulled out your slide rule.
In order to understand how you can have an impact on the computer solution for rendezvous, you have to break it into its essential parts. And we worked, and of course I wrote my thesis on how one could have line of sight guidance and make minor corrections in a rather unsophisticated way, a little gun sight that could make some calculations and corrections inherent in understanding the nominal trajectory. And so I could see where you could apply these two corrections when you observe that it's not, the intercept is not going as you planned. If it's deviating away from a collision, you can put it back on a collision course with a velocity change correction. And that's all mid-course corrections really are. Once you establish an approximate intercept, you then make corrections.
3-7.
My contribution to the Gemini rendezvous was to arrange so that the normal rendezvous took place in a way so that if something failed, you could take over. And not only that, but we could check on the performance of the primary guidance system. So throughout the intercept, we made calculations, manual calculations based upon measurements that could be made from the cockpit of the motion that was being followed throughout the intercept. And we trained all the crews from the very first rendezvous, and I helped devise the training procedures. So every crew did this, but it wasn't until the very last mission that any of the major components of rendezvous, the radar, the computer, or the inertial platform, failed and caused the crew to have to make use of these calculations until our mission. And what we had happen was that the computer would track a number of times and would come up with a solution for intercept. Well, the radar had dropped out some as we were approaching this one time, and we knew we wanted to initiate the intercept, but it didn't have a solution. But we knew what the normal solution was, and we made some calculations, and we executed the normal solution. But then, since the computer didn't know that that we had done that and that it had picked that solution, we had to continue with the backup calculations. But at the same time, the ground tracking was coming up with their solution, and they were all relatively close. So at least we did get to verify that onboard calculations could be done and could execute. We sort of knew that, but it hadn't actually been tested, and I was very fortunate to feel that, at least on my flight, I got to execute what we had trained so much for.
What did you do? Did you pull out a slide rule and some paper and go to work?
No, the solutions were all as part of the normal procedures. We had forms and little charts to make the calculations on, and it was readily apparent there. I did carry a slide rule with me in case we needed to carry out some other kind of calculations. We could have, of course, communicated to the ground and asked them to calculate what it was. So it was more or less of a souvenir that I carried on the flight.
Good, okay, cut. Your things. Hubolt said basically, you know, that docking was as simple as parking a car in a garage. Would you agree with that?
Yes, except parking a car in the garage is not moving, and the car can only move in really 2 dimensions. At the 3rd dimension, up and down, isn't available. That's what tends to complicate things a little bit. But I know exactly what I was talking about, and I can remember just sort of in a fantasy way being in my swimming pool and having the diving board extend over, and I'd get on my back and move slowly like this, looking up at the stars at night. But I could see that what I needed to do is to swim underneath the diving board. It was sort of like executing a docking maneuver, and there were a certain amount of similarities in it.
That's a great way to practice. Now, when you first, you talked about how you got the study that you did at MIT. When you first got, especially you, when you first got into the astronaut program, there was very much a test pilot culture. And while you were a pilot, you were not a test pilot. Mm-hmm. Did you sense the difference when you got in? Was there a division between the guys who were the test pilot, right stuff kind of guys and the pilots?
There was a distinct difference. the test pilot, white scarf, I know it all, and we're the commanders of the spacecraft. There certainly was that aspect, and it was kind of a macho, I'm in charge of things. Test pilots are extremely accurate pilots in executing one phase or another and recording all the data. And normally a pilot doesn't get that precise in any of his flying. And I learned this after the space program when I commanded the test pilot school. I'd never been through any of the training before, but they asked someone who'd at least flown in space to command the test pilot school. It wasn't a very wise choice, I don't think, from my career perspective. And that's sort of what led me to decide that continuing on in an Air Force career, when that was the best kind of thing that they could offer me, wasn't really all that promising. But anyway, there was a test pilot mentality, and there was a fighter pilot competition between the Navy and the Air Force that I think a lot of people may say, well, it's very healthy competition, but I think in many ways there was a vindictiveness kind of behind it, and a little bit of a meanness, a gotcha attitude, and trying to put the other guy down. And I don't think it was really too healthy and too professional. It may have gotten a lot of snickers and a lot of applause from various people, but I think it was carried out, of course, in the spirit of fun, but I think it was also, how can you find out somebody's weakness and then kind of push that weakness? Well, if you come in as an egghead academic who understands rendezvous and they don't know that, then you create kind of a resentment from the people that, they don't want to be told something that someone else knows that they don't know. And I found that made it kind of difficult to get along with other people when there was that somewhat resentment to be helped from the outside in an area that they didn't quite understand. I didn't understand a lot of the things that the test pilots maybe knew and understood and were able to perform in ways that maybe I didn't have some of those skills. But I didn't feel that was a reason for trying to put the other person down. I thought that was really uncalled for.
Well, you had a PhD, Phi Beta Kappa, and very proud of that stuff. Did you feel like, hey, not invented here attitude was going on at points?
Not invented here attitude exists today among big corporations, among NASA. What I've been able to do is to carry on this relative motion business and to look for better strategies of going to and from the moon. And I found that if one could have repeating trajectories where you go back and forth, that this might have some advantage. And whereas for moving from the surface of the Earth to the surface of the moon, it may not have a clear advantage over the normal way of getting onto something and then maybe rendezvousing and then landing with something else, or going in a more direct way. But in going to Mars, I've found that it's very useful strategy and can be very sustaining, because it gives you something that you can use over and over again for 15, 20, 30 years, the way we use transportation systems for long periods of time, and this can result in tremendous savings. And the cycling orbits that I've developed have had essentially zero assistance from the NASA people and zero assistance from any corporations, because it's a not invented here idea. It's a strategy that a number of people admire, but they're not willing to put their time and effort into helping someone else's idea. And I think that's really a shame. And it's called not invented here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Give me a footage count. When Slayton.
There was a time, and it's been written about. I wrote about it in my book, and other people have talked about it. I think there was a crew assigned to Apollo 7, or to at least the first Apollo mission, and maybe there was consideration for a crew for the next mission. And about that time, Deke Slayton brought in about 18 people, maybe a few more, into a room and told us that he didn't know how the rotation of missions and crews were going to happen, but as far as he was concerned, anyone that was in that room was capable of being on the first landing mission. It was just going to happen in a normal rotation sequence. And of course, those the normal crew sequence was that you had a prime and a backup crew for a mission that was coming up immediately, and then you usually had 2 more crews assigned, so that when the backup crew for this mission, after the prime crew flew, there were already crews assigned to the next 2, so the backup could become the primary for the third mission. So as the numbers went, Apollo 7, Neil and I were in the backup crew for Apollo 8. Then there was Apollo 9 and 10 that had crews already assigned. So from the backup to Apollo 8, we would be in line to fly as a primary crew for Apollo 11, unless there were some other circumstances that came along. And the way that the missions were lined up, with a C mission being a command module in Earth orbit, a D mission being a lunar module in Earth orbit. An E mission was somewhat of a repeat of the D mission. It was just another test of the landing craft in Earth orbit. Then the F mission would be taking the lander and the command module to the moon and doing an exercise with the lander, but not landing. The G mission would then be the culmination. It would be the final landing on the moon. So those were the basic missions: C, D, E, F, and G. And
Don't space on me.
That's all right, I was waiting for that.
All right, so
so there was a C mission, and Apollo 7 was scheduled to fly that one, and they flew that. But as they were getting ready to do that, the D mission with its crew was going to fly the lunar module in Earth orbit, but the lunar module was not available. So that crew slid to the next flight, and the E mission crew, which was Borman, Anders, and Collins at that time, were moved into the next mission, a C prime mission. But by that time, Collins had dropped out, and Lovell, from the backup crew with Neil and myself, moved in to fill in Collins' position. So that was going to be a C prime mission. The crew that was going to fly the first lunar module was assigned to Apollo 9, and once it flew, after Apollo 8 was successful, Apollo 9 was successful in Earth orbit, it was considered that it wasn't necessary, or we didn't really have the time to fly another lunar module test in Earth orbit. We could advance to the F mission, which was the test of the lunar module and a sort of a dress rehearsal. So Apollo 10 flew that, and then Apollo 11. Of course, with the success of 9 and 10, we'd already been announced that we would be the first potential lunar landing crew on Apollo 11, and that was before 9 and 10 flew. So it was a program of assignments based upon a very success-oriented sequence of events.
did it matter to you? I mean, were you excited about having that first shot at being the first on the moon?
Well, there was a period of time where we weren't sure, after Apollo 8 flew, whether it was going to be confirmed what we suspected. And I felt that that was just a period of time that had elapsed. It was many years later that I guess I heard or read somewhere, and it was referred to as being in Frank's book, that the mission of landing on the moon was offered to Apollo 8 crew when they came back, and that they turned it down. I knew nothing about this, and when I talked about it to Lovell later, he said, yes, Frank turned it down, but he didn't ask Lovell and Anders, who would have then been on the first lunar landing crew, which would have quite a bit upset the sequence. And I don't know it obviously would have disappointed us tremendously because we would have been assigned to a later crew. There are a lot of ways of guessing as to what might have been in somebody's mind, whether people actually thought that we'd ever successfully carry out the 7, 8, 9, and 10 missions so that 11 could land. I think a lot of people felt, well, certainly something will go wrong and Apollo 12 will get to be the first landing. Of course, that was an all-Navy crew, and there were people who said, well, they wanted to be the first anyway.
So when you finally knew, okay, you're up, this is going to be it, did you feel like you had enough time then to prepare? There were only like 4 months where you were really sure that you were going to be the first crew. Was everything jammed into?
Well, we were assigned the Apollo 11 mission in mid-January, and it wasn't until mid-July that we were going to fly. So we had about a full 6 months, but then, of course, it wasn't until March that the lunar module was tested successfully in Apollo 9. And, of course, then it advanced our chances to be the first landing crew a good bit. I think that as we moved along, we knew that many things had to be done, but if the LEM proved out successful in its tests, certainly you could continue to fly it many, many times before actually executing the landing, but why not move toward it? And I don't think we really had any concern that we were being pushed ahead too much. We knew that we wanted to execute that landing, and we could do it within the time period that we were given. We knew everyone else wanted to see it happen during the year 1969. So I didn't sense that we felt we were rushed at all. When it came about a month before the mission, maybe it was even less than that, because it might have been timed with the detection of the Soviet big rocket that was standing by for launch. And it was about 2 or maybe 3 weeks before that they tried to launch it, and it failed. And then that gave us more breathing room at that point. They could have given us another month then, but we were asked, were we ready to go? And we all kind of agreed, yes, we're ready to go at the scheduled time in July.
Now, with all the preparation you had for flying the vehicle and so forth, I want to talk about geology, because that comes in here. Take me back a bit. When the geologists first started looking for seats on board, we talked about the astronaut test pilot culture. Mm-hmm. How did they receive the geologist scientists, the people who would come on as scientist astronauts, the famous hyphenated astronauts? What was the reception to them?
Well, I don't know as I want to comment on it. I certainly didn't consider myself a science astronaut. I wasn't a test pilot, but I certainly had combat. I demonstrated my abilities by shooting down MiGs that I was as good a pilot as the rest of them. I just hadn't been formally through the test pilot training. There was an attitude that looked down maybe on the scientists as being passengers or experimenters and not the elite in the pilot category. That may still exist today, but I'm not quite that familiar with it, because many of the pilot people from the military services are assigned as mission specialists, but they don't usually cross that line and become commanders or second in command. The geologists would like to have put a scientist on a mission, and Jack Schmitt was the logical person. There really wasn't any other who was that qualified, and he worked very closely training the crews in the dress rehearsal landing in Apollo 10, and briefed them on the geology to be looking for, and even before the landing, and he trained us a good bit. I felt in our mission that we were describing things, but maybe in a superficial way. If you really wanted geology, you don't send a pilot as an observer who's then going to draw conclusions. I think you have to carefully examine the specimens, take a lot of pictures. Don't rely on the on-the-spot evaluations and judgments. They're kind of window dressing. They're public relations. It's saying the right thing to the right people. and you sound like you know what you're talking about. I felt that there was an awful lot of that going on. We were doing geology to be able to get across the point that we understood what we were doing. We had a good grasp, but we were not really on-the-spot observers. And even a very trained geologist, I think, needs to be cautious about giving on-the-spot observations. I think there are many things that you can draw conclusions about, but you need that ultimate test and verification by other people confirming what it is.
Well, I'll go back to the landing, but since we're on that subject, when you stepped down and started looking around, you identified one rock and you said, that looks like biotite. And you got some reaction from the geology community when you did that. Tell me about that. What happened? What did you call it and why?
I don't know why that word popped into my mind, but I saw something that looked like it had a shiny surface to it, and I thought, well, I'll call it that. I also said, oh, look, there's a purple rock. And what I wanted to say was something so absurd. I mean, you would never find a purple rock. Maybe the more absurd one would be a green one, but there are some minerals that are greenish color, but not very many are purple. But I did see something that had just a faint suggestion of a little color to it, and I said, oh, there's a purple rock. But it was more a feeble attempt at being a little bit humorous, the same way when I was backing down the ladder, I said, well, I'll be very careful not to close the door and make sure I don't lock it on my way out.
Well, how did the geology community respond to your description of biotite on the moon? What did they say?
Oh, I could care less. And they probably say, well, what's that guy know about geology? Because biotite, of course, is something that's a sedimentary, I guess I'm going to get myself into deeper trouble, probably. Well, we're proceeding with the descent, and we're kind of yawed over so that we're looking at the ground, and we're going with our feet first, which means that the ground is moving along this way as our feet are moving this way. So we're watching landmarks going by, and I had no means of really measuring the landmarks to compare them with where we should be. So I didn't spend a lot of time trying to identify them because I could see that that was not going to be part of my job. My job was more the numbers and the time and the altitude and comparing the two computers. Neil had a grid, and so he could be the observer, and he could time the progression of different craters as they went along. And there was some point, maybe 3 or 4 minutes into the descent, when he made an observation that looks like we may be a little bit long. And I thought, geez, how can he possibly suspect that? But it turned out that we were a little bit long. But I'm not sure whether it was because of that particular observation. He surprises me a number of times when he comes up with an observation turns out later to be correct. But about that time, we needed to yaw around so that we could then get ready to pitch forward in that part of the trajectory. And as soon as you yaw around, then the landing radar can begin to acquire the surface. And as it began to feed information as to what the altitude and altitude rate were, the computer compared this with what it had, and it came up with a difference. And then it would begin to narrow that difference down, indicating that you were closing in on the solution. And this number was displayed to us. And as soon as we got the lock on, it began to do this. But about that time, as I was watching this happen, we had a computer alarm come on, which meant that the numbers that I was looking at on the 3 different registers, usually X, Y, and Z, or some other numbers, altitude rate, and delta P, or whatever it was for the radar, we no longer had these numbers going with time, but we had this alarm and a flashing light. So it interrupted our monitoring of the trajectory, and 1201 or 1202 didn't mean anything to either one of us. Now, over here in the bottom of our filing cabinet, we had a big dictionary that you could look those things up. But during the descent, we weren't about to pick that up as long as we had communication. So we asked the ground what was the meaning of this. And after they looked up and tried to understand what was causing this, they could see, evidently, that the time that the computer took to go around polling the different things that it was going to be doing in each cycle, and those cycles were maybe in a fraction of a second. It would be polling these different ones, performing the different tasks. It was supposed to be done within a certain time, and then, of course, there was a significant pad of time, so it would normally only take maybe 20–30% of the time to do that, but it got a little bit above this, and they set a gate on this, and when it exceeded that gate, then it caused the alarm. And the reason after the fact was because it was processing rendezvous radar data and landing radar data at the same time. I'm not sure whether we were still locked on to Mike Collins and his transponder, but the MIT people didn't figure that anyone would be doing both of these at the same time, so they set that gate a little bit lower. Well, anyway, the caution light came on. We didn't know what it was, and after some number of seconds, we got the call that it was okay because it just interrupted and diverted our attention from what we were doing for a period of time. Then we could go back and catch up where we were. And as long as this didn't keep happening too frequently, we could proceed on. And so that's what they were watching. How frequently would these alarms come on? And I guess in retrospect, I would have thought there might have been 6 or 7. Maybe there were fewer, or maybe there were more. I'm not sure which. But we had both 1201 and 1202. Once we got down to about 1,000 feet, that wasn't a problem anymore. And at 500 feet, Neil took over manually and controlled the craft, and then began to divert it from where we were going to land a little bit long. So the computer alarm was one of concern for the people on the ground, and it was some concern for us because it diverted our attention, but it really was not a serious problem.
When did Neil ever communicate to you? He said you knew you were going a little long, but when did you really get a sense that you were definitely long? You were not coming down in the footprint that you had plotted out.
Oh, I don't think I understood that, or he understood that. The landing site that we picked was such that there wasn't any characteristic landmark that you could identify in the close vicinity. It was beyond those, so it was just a sense, a question of, well, if you saw something that was on the map and then the landing was further away. But again, that was not part of my challenge to understand those things. That was the person who could do something about it, who was looking out the window. If I was expected to do that, then I should have been looking out the window, but that would have diverted my attention from the abort guidance and the primary guidance and all the other instruments. So we had to split the tasks, and there wasn't much point in paying attention to the other guy's task. And that was Neil's job. Neil's job was flying the thing, and so, when you look at it, why would you, for example, want to train both crew members to fly the manual landing in a dangerous machine like the lunar landing training vehicle that Neil had to bail out of? Well, if it's not for any useful purpose, why train people in doing that? So if you understand those things and then you say, well, no, I don't really see why I need to fly that, then people will say, well, you don't want to fly it because you're afraid of it. Well, that's not the truth at all. You take risks that are appropriate. And,
well, at a certain point, though, you knew you were coming down on fuel. You knew you were getting lower than you wanted to be.
Yeah, but we didn't have anything to compare it with. We'd done training missions many times. They had never given us a training mission where we were coming in and about to land, but we didn't quite have enough fuel to be able to do it. Now, you say, well, how could you possibly train for a lunar landing mission and not have one of those cases? Well, it was not ours to try and say, well, hey, wait a minute, you simulation guys, why don't you give us one where we can't quite make it? You know, this is not the way you played the game.
Okay, but good. You took me, before, when we were talking about moonshot, you took me down to those last few seconds. You were getting a little kind of like, let's get this thing down. So take me down to the last few seconds when Neil is kind of searching around, looking for a place to put it down. Was there a little bit of anxiety, a little concern on your part about where you were going to get that landing and when you were going to get it down? Not fear, but just what's going on?
Well, it's really hard to compare the recollections of the actual mission. Of course, you could play that back again and see and examine all the different parts, but it just seemed to me as though whatever he was doing, I couldn't help him out very much in any way other than giving him the numbers that he didn't need to look down at the computer because he was concentrating on out the window. But I could see that we'd leveled off and we started to climb and then we went back down again. I didn't know why, but I could also see that we'd been doing this for you know, a good number of seconds, and then when 60 seconds and the light came on and we were still not real close to the ground, we were maybe 100, 120 feet, I forget exactly what it was, then I guess I was getting a little concerned, but what could I do? Could I say, hey, Neil, hurry up, get it on the ground? That would just excite him a little bit more, so I couldn't say that. All I could do was try and, you know, just give him my encouragement, silent encouragement, body English in a way that he couldn't quite understand. And it's really hard to say when you're that concerned because, you know, you're doing something for the first time anyway, so you've got a lot of concern about it, and you're just kind of hoping that it's going to work out right. And at the call out of 30 seconds, which we didn't have any indication of the fuel level at that point, we knew that it was ticking away somewhere and the fuel was getting less and less. But the ground had a better indication, so they called out 30 seconds, but we were maybe 15 feet above the ground, and in just a few seconds we were on the ground then.
When the moment of touchdown, what happened?
Well, at the moment of touchdown, we had the contact light come on, and we didn't go back up in the air, so I knew that we had the probe, which was about 5 feet from the landing gear, had been moved enough to cause the contact light to turn on. So what we wanted to do at that point was to stop the engine, because you don't want to land and keep the engine burning because you might pop back up into the air. So I called out contact light, engine stop, and then once you do that, you don't want to keep firing the jets, so you have to hit the hand controller, and that's why I call it ACA at a detent, which means you just hit the hand controller, which would stop the jets from firing, and then you'd go and do some of the other shutdown procedures.
Of course, what you're waiting for in those first seconds is an abort, right? Like, do we have to get out of here right away? Was that not the case?
No. Once you stop the engine, you're there.
Good. Let me change the, in good shape.
Just set your not ready.
Okay.
In any landing where you have a vertical thrust, like a helicopter or a rocket thrusting, as you're coming down, there's a combination of conditions where if the engine stops, you have a certain descent rate maybe, or maybe you're just hovering. If the engine stops, you're going to hit the ground if you don't do anything. And then there are a number of seconds before you can take some action, whether it's with that engine or with the ascent engine, to make the abort cycle and separate and do all those things that take fractions of a second to happen. And by the time those correct the error of the descent going down to one going back up again, you may hit the ground. So, you know, these are situations that are going to occur close to the ground in any normal situation. And they can happen, I mean, the chances of them happening are greater if you're running low on fuel. Because if you run out of fuel right while you're in that place, you may hit the ground before you can get the ascent engine going. But then again, if you run out of fuel and you're only 5 feet above the surface, you don't want to abort because you're not going to hit hard enough to make any difference. It's going to be a good, successful landing.
Now, when you actually landed, there was a lot of dust kicked up. Were you surprised by the amount of dust that kicked up? I thought I recollected somebody saying, you know, a lot more than...
No, as the lander got closer to the surface, there was an obscuration of the little rocks that were sitting because there was a fanning outward with the sun coming from behind us, causing shadows. And that fanning outward was the dust being blown out. It didn't billow up because it would only billow up if there was an atmosphere. So it was going straight out, and it was obscuring the surface like a very thin layer of fog or dust. And you had no idea how deep that was, but it couldn't have been more than 6 inches or a foot maybe. So that picking up some dust is what I said over the air, as I could see the shadow of the probe in the back from the sun. I could see the shadow of that coming closer and closer, and that meant that we were 5, 6 feet, well, maybe 7 or 8 feet above the surface. So I could see picking up a shadow and then dust, and then I knew we were very close. And then contact light, engine stop.
No, no worries of Thomas Gold's 30 feet of lunar dust that was going to swallow the spacecraft, I take it.
Well, Thomas Gold would have been very famous had we sunk in. And, people who are doomsday predictors are motivated by the glory they will get if the doomsday occurs, and they happen to be predicting it right. But if it doesn't occur, then people won't remember them anyway. So it's a pretty good gamble to claim something dangerous is going to happen. If it doesn't happen, they forget about it. But if it does, you're the big predictor.
Now, how long did it take you? Once you landed, I mean, come on, you're a human being. Did you look out and say, wow, this is really something? I know you were very busy with all of what was going on in the spacecraft, but when did it finally dawn on you that, hey, we're here, we're on the surface of the moon, we did it?
As soon as we touched down, I knew we'd done it. But I knew that there were certain discrete times after the nominal touchdown. If something was wrong, you don't want to abort right away. You want to wait until this discrete time because they're more favorable rendezvous conditions. And after about 2 minutes, then it's too late, really, because if you were to lift off after 2 minutes after the normal landing, Mike Collins is going round and round, and he's too far ahead for you to catch up to him in a reasonable time, and he's going to have to do some other maneuvers so that you can catch up with him. So those first couple of minutes are very crucial to look around and see if everything is okay, and hope that the Earth is measuring everything, the status of all your pressure systems and your tanks and your electrical systems, because if you do have to abort, you should do it right away. And I felt that that was a fairly critical time, so it surprised me that during that time Neil chose to make the call, Houston Tranquility Base, the Eagle has landed. It surprised me a little bit because we'd never trained to do that because we didn't want to tell them back in the simulators and the training what we were going to say after we landed. And I expected he would wait until we'd been there so that we could monitor those things. But, it's something that is a surprise, but then you understand, well, that's the way you should do it. You should call right away, things like that.
Did you two acknowledge it at all to each other? Hey, after all this tension, we're here? You and Neil?
Well, we looked at each other, and I patted him on the back a little bit. That was about the extent of it. We knew we were there. We didn't have to. We smiled at each other. I think that was about the extent of it.
Got to be a hell of a moment, though. Can't wait
It
to
sure
see
is. There's nothing you can say, do really, that could live up to the emotion of the moment. Everything would be an understatement. No matter what you do, would be understating the whole thing.
Were you anxious to get out? How long did it finally take you till you descended from the LEM yourself?
Well, it took an interminable time until we went through. We didn't have a timeline specifically because the way the flight plan was written, we were going to rest and then go out later. Well, we decided not to do that, so we had a lot of time because there wasn't any really concrete sequence of times that we had to live up to, so we just took our time and felt we would, if we were more relaxed in what we did, we'd be less likely to omit something or to make some kind of a mistake. But once we landed on the surface, for the next 2 hours, everything was geared toward the potential launch one orbit later for Mike coming around. Because if we did have a problem after that 2 minutes of initial abort, then we would have to get ready to abort one orbit later as he came around. And that was something that I had inserted into the flight plan maybe a year ahead in some of the, before crews were ever announced. Jack Schmidt and I and maybe a few others looked at different things that we could do, and I suggested that maybe the best thing you should do right after you got on the surface is get ready to leave at the earliest normal opportunity, which was one orbit later. And here was an example that I felt that, you know, it's probably been 4 or 5 days since you've trained on those launch procedures. Now is a good opportunity to do a dress rehearsal as if you are going to leave when you know that nothing's wrong, so you probably aren't. So you just go through the exercise. None of the crews later did that. And I think that they should have, because, but it was another example of not invented here. A crew comes along and they look at what the others do and they say, well, no, we don't have to do that. We'll do it our way, you know.
So how long, so you waited 2 hours before you, well, Neil, obviously Neil.
Then we started getting ready, and that took 2 or 3 hours, I think, before we were ready to go outside. And then it was a question of, you know, he went out, he had a number of things to do. We sent the camera down, he had to pick up the contingency sample, and then it was my turn to go down.
Good. How much footage we got? Let's cut for a second. You referred to it as magnificent desolation. I mean, your description of the moon. What was it like? What was it like when you stepped on it? Were you surprised by the surface? Describe it to me.
Well, the first thing that I wanted to do when I got on the surface was to hold on and to just sort of bounce around and check the mobility that I had, and then let go and see what the footing was like. And all that took was maybe 30 seconds or a minute to feel that I knew how to move around with great confidence. And that's all the later crews really needed to do. So I was doing that for my benefit, but for their benefit too. And later on in the spacewalk outside, when I jumped around and pranced around, again, I was doing that for the benefit of the people back on Earth, to see and to measure and see what the mobility was like, so that it would give something in addition to our verbal description of observations when we got back. The things that we did on that first mission, I felt were done to make later missions more successful. So we would pioneer, we would look and see what the condition of the lander was, take pictures of it, so that later on the people wouldn't have to spend the time doing that. Our mission really was to put out some simple experiments, the laser reflector, the passive seismometer, to verify that the leveling devices, that the antennas worked, to do some quick sampling of the surface. Because our lander was heavier than the later landers, we didn't have the room for the consumables or the margin to be able to stay out, to go out twice, for example, or to stay out even longer. And whatever the flight plan and the engineers decided our mission was going to be and how many hours we could stay out, that was it. There wasn't any point in say, well, hey, let's change that so we can, instead of staying out 2.5 hours, that we can stay out 4 hours. Gee, the guys did the calculations and they said that's what you could do, so that's what we stuck with.
Did you feel that that there was enough science, too much science? Visual impressions or acuity about being on the lunar surface that struck you as being different?
I don't think there were any real surprises. It was just such a contrast with anything that we'd ever been able to see here on Earth. There was the curvature, the very distinctness of everything that we looked at, because there's no haze, no atmosphere, and the the dark sky, you just can't create those things here. You see the dark sky from orbit when you look out, and it's the same looking sky, but now you have the horizon there also, because you're on the surface. So that's a little bit different, and that's hard to create. But the objects that are on the horizon are very distinct, and they're maybe only a mile, mile and a half away, but if there's a rock out there on Earth, you probably wouldn't see it because it would be obscured with the haze, perhaps, or the atmosphere. But on the moon, you could see it. The balance that you have is different. You have a lot more stability, but you have less indications of what you're. By having more stability, what I mean is that if you exceed your boundary, if your center of mass gets outside, you're going to begin to tip over, but it's so much easier to recover there than it would be here. But your cues in your feet are much less because you weigh 1/6 what you would weigh here, and you have very soft boots. They're not like hard-soled shoes. They're very, very pliable moon boots, you know.
Well, I talked to a guy named Wasserberg, who's a big geologist, and he said, you know, let me just stop for a second. He said that even the few samples that you...
Well, we brought back some rocks, and they were different than rocks that anybody had really ever seen before. Maybe they'd seen tektites or other things that may have come from the moon, but we brought back real samples. Maybe we couldn't describe them very well, or we just grabbed them and stuck them, but they were different than anything people had seen here before, so there was a big change in our understanding of the moon. And later missions added to that. But the big change was between having no moon rocks and now we have a few. Whether they were described by the crew or not is very unimportant. Now we have some samples of the moon, and we have statements made by people, and we've gone over them over and over again, and everything we saw, everything we said has been analyzed. But is that the significance of going to the moon? In no way is it. It is that people alive today, when I meet them, they want me to know where they were when we landed on the moon. They want me to remember because they remember. And this is multiplied over millions and millions of people who were alive and had their lives changed. That is the significance of going to the moon. It's not the rocks that were brought back, the little knowledge that we gained that we didn't have before. Is that changing our lives now? No. But America went to the moon. We made a commitment. We carried through that commitment. And that commitment to do that so impressed the Soviets that it brought about eventually the end of the Cold War. Now, not too many people are going to draw that comparison. I can go into more details about making a commitment to strategic defense that they didn't want to see us do because they knew that would ruin their economy. But when you do things like that, you demonstrate the character of the human species, the curiosity to want to explore, but now you don't do that until you're challenged by societies that challenge you in one way or the other, and now you want to competitively make a commitment to do that. That's the nature of the American spirit, and that's what the achievement of going to the moon means, because it meant so much to all those people who were alive. We'd never been to a place like that before, and we haven't been there since. And the longer it takes to go back, in a way, the greater the significance of having done Apollo 11 and the other missions, the greater significance that that'll have as a place in history. Why couldn't we do that again? Because it was difficult to do then. The engineering tasks, step by step, in retrospect, sound very logical, sound very orderly, but you had to have that rocket, you had to have that commitment, you had to have that investment. There are a lot of lessons learned about Apollo, but how many people say, what came after Apollo? We built that Saturn V rocket. The first stage had 5 engines. Monstrous engines, never been built anything like that really since, that large an engine. They were never used again. We had hydrogen engines, 5 of them in the second stage, and one of the same engines in the third stage that got us into orbit. That was the pioneering of Apollo that the Russians didn't want to take. They didn't want to take the risk of a hydrogen engine, so they had to build a much bigger rocket that never succeeded. But we made a commitment to build hydrogen engines. Wonderful engines, the J2 engines, never used again. Why? Because America wants to start over again. And we defined a shuttle that had a cockpit and a booster. It wasn't necessary at all, but it made the cost too high. I'm just alluding to some lessons that were learned from Apollo that are meaningful today, but people don't want to pay attention to those lessons. They want to say, what did he say? Who got out first? That's not important. What's important is that we landed on the moon. We made a commitment, and people remember that worldwide.
Should we go back to the moon? Is that a viable goal?
We'll go back to the moon in a logical way as we prepare to go to Mars. We might be able to justify going to the moon for the lunar ice and then see what happens, but I think that would be a mistake. I think the thing that we have to do is to make a commitment to reduce the cost, make a commitment to reusability, realistic reusability, not single stage to orbit. That's pushing technology too far right now. We need 2-stage reusability. We need to define a next generation shuttle. And we need it to do a profit-making business. And the profit-making business is tourism in space. And in order to make a profit by putting people into that second stage, you have to have 80 or 100 people. That's not what NASA's going to want to design the next generation shuttle for. We have to define it for the American people, for the people around the world, for a new industry. And if it's 2-stage and we're putting 100 people up there, we're going to want to fly it quite rapidly, get it back on the ground again soon. So it's only up there for 1 day, maybe 2, because it can be very cramped because we have to have paying customers in there. And it's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be for the wealthy. That's not going to be very attractive unless we use my scheme of having a lottery to pick 1 or 2% of the passengers. That's what Share Space Foundation is all about. Why do I say 2-stage? Because once you get 100 people up there many times, you want to keep them up there for a week. How do you get a hotel up there for people to stay at in a week? The way we build the space station? 5 years, 50 launches? No way. You're going to have a reusable heavy lift rocket. How do you get that? You take that first stage rocket of the 2-stage and you put 4 of them around an external tank. Now you have a heavy lift rocket that those 4 come back and land. The other part goes into orbit. We bring the engines down and we use that big tank plus the whole payload to make a hotel for 150 or 200 people. And that's a profit-making business. That's tourism. That's a hotel, a resort business. Now we built the reusable heavy lift rocket that'll take us to the moon and to Mars. That's the way we have to do things.
That's great. That's good. Finally, for the geology community and so forth, they're all disappointed.
You brush your Apollo, there's a little piece of that.
We didn't, there you got it. We didn't go far enough. You think Apollo achieved its objectives, do you not, or don't you? Do you think we should have gone all the way through 20 missions, Apollo 20? Final statement.
You can learn so many things in retrospect, and one of the things I think we could have done is to use that first stage and changed it a little bit, put some wings on it, and made a reusable first stage out of the first stage of the Saturn the Saturn V rocket, the S1C. In retrospect, could have been a reusable first stage. To have a realistic fleet, you'd need 3 or 4 of those. So you'd have to have reserved that many. You'd have to take the second stage or the third stage and make an orbiter out of that. We could have done those things had we had the imagination and the foresight to see that the program was going to be so constrained later on. Sure, we could have flown every single Saturn we had, and then we wouldn't have had anything to put up Skylab. I think the Skylab mission with the Saturn V was a most efficient way of demonstrating how to put a space station up with one launch. But we didn't follow through on that. We decided we're going to build a space station with the cargo bay of the shuttle, which is 60 feet long, but it gets smaller and smaller when you start putting a bunch of other things in there. And the capacity, I mean, look how many launches it's going to take to put up a habitable laboratory for 6 or 7 people. That's not the way to do it. That's a lesson from the space station before we ever finish building it, that we have to learn how to make it different. And a single-staged orbit as a follow-on to the shuttle will never be able to put up an efficient space station of the size that I'm talking about.
Okay, okay, good. Great.